Howdy folks, I'm Ben Starr, the ultimate food geek. Welcome back to my messy kitchen. And it has been just over 4 months since I published my simple sourdough for lazy people recipe. The response has been overwhelming. I have received hundreds of photographs and thank you notes from folks who are discovering that they can produce delicious artisan quality sourdough bread super easy with about 5 minutes of effort a day. On the flip side of this, I'm receiving so many questions and comments that it's taking me hours a day just to try to respond to them all. So I decided to create a follow-up video to demonstrate and answer some of the questions and concerns people have and address some of the very common pitfalls that are repeatedly being brought up in the comments on these videos. Based on the comments, one of the most common pitfalls people are running up against is that their dough seems to be too wet for them to easily work with. Now, this recipe sits at about 63% hydration, which is slightly higher than your normal commercial yeast bread dough recipes, which sit at about 60% hydration. It is going to be slightly more sticky than what you're accustomed to working with if you've been baking with traditional bread dough recipes. However, it's definitely not too sticky to work with. And if your dough is just absolutely so wet that it just slops around and will not form a loaf, there's a different problem here. But the first thing I'm going to do is quickly mix up a batch of this bread and let you take a very close look at how it behaves with your hands. So we're going to do 4 ounces of starter. We'll talk about starter here in a second because it's entirely possible that your starter is too wet. 12 ounces of filtered water. Get the starter dispersed into that water. 1 pound 4 ounces of flour. And 3/4 of an ounce of salt. I'm going to talk about salt later because I do get a lot of questions about the salt content in this recipe, and the salt content is actually intentional. All right, we're going to get this stirred around here. Okay, at this point, as I start to meet resistance with my spoon, you'll see there's still quite a bit of flour left in that bowl. If you're seeing that your dough is a lot more liquidy than this, that's an indication that you added too much water. Either you mismeasured or your sourdough starter is not at 100% hydration with equal parts of flour and water. That is the most common problem I anticipate people are experiencing. But now we're going to get in there with our hands and kind of bring this dough together into its final state. And you can see, I still do have some little bits of flour here that are going to have to be worked in manually. This dough is not incredibly sticky. But as we get the rest of that flour incorporated and the moisture starts to move evenly throughout the dough, you start to get a little bit of tackiness. The dough will stick a little bit to your hands. It shouldn't be crazy, crazy sticky, but it is entirely possible that you'll get some of this stickiness on your hands as you're kneading. That's very common. This is a somewhat sticky dough. However, if your dough looks something like this, which is just really too sticky to be able to work with using normal techniques, that is an indication that your sourdough starter is at a higher hydration than 100%. That means you're adding more water than flour by weight when you feed your starter. And this is actually fairly common. But a typical sourdough starter should be maintained at 100% hydration to be compatible with most recipes. Now I'm going to take both doughs out and work with them a little bit here on the countertop so that you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. You never want to add too much flour to your countertop when you're shaping your loaf because you actually want the dough to stick to the countertop a little bit. That provides the tension that allows you to get a really nice, tight, perfect boule. Now keep in mind, these doughs are just freshly made. They are not risen, so they're not going to have the gluten structure of doughs that have already had their first 24-hour rise. But you'll see, this dough is sliding right around on the countertop. I actually have too much flour on the countertop. It's more important that you put the flour right on your hands and on the outside top of the loaf so that the loaf is only sticking to the countertop as you move it around and not to your hands. Now this is a properly hydrated dough at about 63% according to our recipe, and it's pretty much easy to work with. When we move over to the dough that's a little bit higher hydration, this one's about 68%. You can still certainly work with this dough, but you have to have had a little bit more experience, and this recipe is not going to produce a loaf of that hydration if you've made it properly. But what you want to do is make sure you've got plenty of flour on your hands and plenty of flour on the top part of the dough, and then as you move it around, if the dough starts to stick to you more, add more flour to your hands and more flour to the loaf itself. But here that extra flour is preventing our dough from sticking to the countertop, which makes it harder to form that final loaf. But if you just use plenty of flour on your hands and on the top of the loaf, you'll eventually, now I'm starting to get stuck down there, more flour, you'll eventually be able to form even a really sticky, tacky dough into a really nice loaf, just like that. If you end up with a really sticky loaf, the solution is super simple. Just add a little bit more flour and work it in until your dough is stiff enough to properly work with. Easy as that. So how do we fix a starter that's overly hydrated? Pretty simple. Measure out 8 ounces of your starter and discard the rest of it. I've got 8 ounces here in this bowl. Now we're going to give a feeding that's heavier on flour than on water. And we always want to at least double our starter. And if I've got 8 ounces of starter here, a traditional feeding would be 4 ounces of water and 4 ounces of flour, or 8 extra ounces of feed to double the weight of the starter. But today what I'm going to do is feed 4 ounces of water and 6 ounces of flour. Okay, so I've actually added a total of 10 ounces of ingredients, and it's always fine to feed more than double the weight of your starter. It's just never fine to feed less than double the weight of your starter. So now I'm going to give these a nice stir here, and you'll be able to see that thicker texture happen almost immediately. See that? It's almost stiff as I get in there to stir it. And that is actually the kind of texture you should be expecting after a normal hydration feeding of your starter. If you notice that it's considerably more liquidy after that feeding, let it sit for a couple of hours on the countertop, divide it in half, and give it another one of those stiff feedings of 4 ounces of water and 6 ounces of flour until you start to get a nice thick starter just like this. The next common problem that people report is that their bread doesn't rise very high. It spreads out kind of flat. Still has a nice crumb on the inside, has incredible flavor, but it just doesn't bake up nice and round and perfect like the loaves that you see other people getting. Well, there can be multiple reasons for this. First of all, your starter might not be as robust as it should be. Regular feedings will bring it up into a nice healthy cycle, but the whole point of this recipe is that you don't have to have recently fed your starter in order to create a proper loaf. So let's talk about the size of the baking vessel for a bit. Now, I normally bake this bread in a 5 to 6 quart Dutch oven, just like this. The recipe, it's a 3-pound loaf, does really well in this particular size. Some Dutch ovens are actually a little bit larger than this, and as your bread is rising, if it doesn't have enough strength to hold itself in a perfectly high loaf, it can spread out just a little bit, and that's what results in those wider, flatter loaves. Well, the easiest solution to that is to get a smaller Dutch oven. These little 3 to 4 quart Dutch ovens are actually cheaper. You can find them on Amazon for pretty cheap. And the overall interior diameter of these pots is smaller, which means that as the bread rises, the walls of the Dutch oven are supporting it so that it can achieve a really nice lift. So that's one really easy way, is to just give your bread extra support in the vessel that it's baking in. But the most common cause of a loaf that doesn't rise nice and beautifully is that the bread is either underproofed or overproofed. Now, underproofing isn't really likely with this particular recipe because we're looking at a 12 to 24 hour initial bulk fermentation, followed by a 2 to 4 hour rise before it goes into the oven. It's not really likely that your bread is underproofing unless your starter is just really weak and wasn't particularly strong to begin with. Overproofing is the more common reason for loaves not turning out nice and round and tall. Overproofing just means that your yeast have run out of simple sugars to eat in the dough, and they can't make any more carbon dioxide. Also, the acids that are produced by the bacterial colonies in the starter begin to weaken the gluten structure over time. Once that gluten structure becomes slack, it can't hold in that carbon dioxide and result in a nice puffy loaf. So if you're discovering that your bread is consistently not rising very well, it may very well be that you're overproofing your loaf and you need to shorten that initial bulk fermentation time from 24 hours down to 16 or even 12. And if your starter is crazy robust and raring to go, you might only need to ferment for 8 hours for the first rise. It really just depends on your starter. So if you're getting flatter loaves, the first thing I'm going to tell you is to reduce your rise time by 6 hours on the first fermentation and see if that helps. And if you're going a full 4 hours or longer on the secondary fermentation, that second rise just before the bread goes into the oven, you can try backing that down a little bit as well. All of this is going to teach you how to interact with your starter over the course of its life. Now again, if my starter's been in the fridge for 2 or 3 months without a feeding, I'm going to let it go a full 24 hours for that first bulk fermentation and probably a full 4 hours for the second rise, if not a little bit longer. But if my starter's been fed in the last week or two and I can see 5 or 6 hours after I formed that loaf, it's already starting to rise and put carbon dioxide in my Ziploc bag, starting to inflate like a balloon, I can probably shape that into a loaf, and 2 hours later, it can go into the oven. So it really is about practice makes perfect, getting to know your starter and what timing cycles work best for both of the fermentation stages. On occasion, people contact me and say, my bread is stuck in my pan, I can't get it out, what do I do? This issue typically results from one of 2 errors. The first is that the pot was not preheated enough. Now I'm going to confess, while I'm making these videos, I'm taking a few shortcuts every now and then, and one was to only preheat the pan for 30 minutes. This pot was not hot enough to make sure that the bread did not fuse to it when it first went in. Preheat your pot for a full hour at 500 degrees Fahrenheit or as high as your oven will go, and that will help reduce the risk of the bread sticking inside the pot. Second, if your hydration rate is too high, it's also fairly common for your bread to fuse to your pot during baking. Now, if you recall me showing you that bread that was a little bit too wet and sticky to work with, I didn't actually correct that bread's hydration rate because I'm accustomed to baking with higher hydration loaves. I went ahead and stuffed that bread full of red jalapeno peppers and extra sharp cheddar cheese and baked this beautiful loaf here. But of course, it did stick to the pan. So here's what you do. Do nothing for an hour. You need to be able to hold the pot, and you don't want to be working with a pot that is super hot. Also, when that loaf is very, very warm, it's delicate, it tears easily. You want the bread to be as resilient as possible so you don't just tear the crap out of it while you're trying to get the bread out of the pan. So, once your loaf and pot have fully cooled at least 1 hour, the first thing you want to do is sort of go around the edges to make sure that you don't have any extra sticking that you can easily ameliorate with a knife. Then get yourself the widest, flattest wooden or metal spatula or plastic that you can get in there, and start to pry. And typically, the bread will lift right up. Now, if you try to do this while the bread is hot, it's just going to tear open. But this gorgeous loaf, and you cannot believe how good it smells right now. Now let's chat for just a minute about salt, because my favorite comments were posted almost immediately after I published the recipe. People saying, your recipe's got way too much salt in it. I'm not an idiot, people. I've been studying and baking bread for 2 decades. Yes, most bread recipes call for a ratio of salt that is 1.8 to 2.2% of the overall dry weight of the flour. And in my recipe, the salt is at 3.4%. This is intentional. It is the reason the recipe works and is so idiot-proof and is so flexible in terms of your rise times. The salt is why the recipe is functional. So bread rises because of a compound called gluten that is made up of subproteins called gliadin and glutenin. Now I want you to imagine in the bread dough, these two proteins are a little bit shy. And they look across the dough matrix at each other and they think, oh, you're kind of cute. I might like to hold hands with you just a little bit. But it takes time or excessive kneading to really force these proteins together to form the gluten structure. Glutenin, gliadin, they're a little bit shy. Enter salt, because salt acts like a love potion for glutenin and gliadin. When salt is in that matrix in a high enough quantity, they just grab each other and start making out. In fact, salt almost acts like a handcuff, bonding these two lovers together. It forms a much stronger gluten network, which holds in the carbon dioxide that's being produced by the yeast. And that is why bread rises. So yes, I have upped the salt ratio in this loaf, and that is specifically why the recipe is functional. It's why you don't have to immediately shape the dough into a loaf the instant the first rise reaches double in volume. You can wait another 2 or 3 or 4 hours. It's the reason why you have a 2, 3, 4 hour window once that loaf is shaped before it has to go into the oven. It's also the reason that you can chunk that bread in the fridge for 2 or even 3 days before you bake it, and it still isn't going to overproof. So, dispense with the comments about the salt. If you've baked the bread and tasted it, and you can check the other comments, it's delicious. It's not too salty. Unless you happen to have a European accent. Because overall, the European diet has less sodium in it than the American or Australian or Asian diets. So yes, if you're a European viewer, you may find this bread a little bit too salty for your palate. Or if you're an American that never dines out, only cooks at home, and cooks on a very sodium-restricted diet, you may also find that this bread is slightly on the salty side. The easy fix is to lower the salt. Take it down to ½ an ounce, or even less if you need to. The bread won't be quite as flavorful, and you're going to have to be a little bit more vigilant about your rising time. As soon as that bread hits double on the first rise, you need to shape it into a loaf, and then you need to watch it. As soon as it doubles in volume, it needs to go into the oven then, or it can overproof if it sits out on the counter for an extra 2 or 3 hours. Whereas, in the original recipe, those extra 2 or 3 hours probably isn't going to lead to an overproofing of the dough. Now, there are a few people who genuinely said, this bread is so salty that I can't eat it. And after going back and forth with them a little bit, I realized what they actually did was translate my recipe from weight measurements into volume measurements and said, oh, well, it said, 3/4 of an ounce of salt is really about 3 teaspoons of salt. So I used 3 teaspoons of salt. You can't do it, people. Get a scale. 3/4 of an ounce of salt is the same amount of salt, whether it's Morton's kosher salt or Diamond Crystal kosher salt or finely ground sea salt, or even iodized table salt. 3/4 of an ounce is always the same regardless of the type of salt. But if you have 3 people measure out 3 teaspoons of this Morton's kosher salt, you will get 3 different weights. And if you have 1 person measure out 3 teaspoons of Morton's kosher salt as opposed to 3 teaspoons of table salt, you will get different amounts of salt. So the only way to properly make this recipe, folks, is to weigh your ingredients, and the salt is the key to it all happening. One of the really lovely things about this recipe is that on the second day after you've shaped your bread into a loaf, if something comes up and you won't be ready to bake that loaf in the next 2 to 4 hours or so, you can chunk the loaf in the fridge to slow down its fermentation, and the loaf is going to taste better at the end if you do that. But a lot of people are asking, well, if my loaf is in the fridge and I'm preheating my oven, does it go straight from the fridge into the oven, or do I need to put it out on the countertop for several hours first? And the simple answer is, I don't know. I do it both ways, just sort of depending on how I'm feeling or what my schedule is like. I had never done a direct comparison of a loaf that was baked straight from the fridge as opposed to one that was left out on the countertop for a couple hours to warm up before it went in the fridge. So I performed an experiment. Here we have a loaf that had absolutely no fridge time. It was started on day 1, it was baked on day 2. We're going to compare this loaf to these other 2 that were started on the same day from the same batch of dough and baked both ways to test. Now these are not full-size loaves, they are 2/3 the size. I doubled my recipe and made 1 batch of dough, divided that dough into 3 loaves to produce this, so that we had fairly equivalent results. They all started from the same starter, same flour, same water. This loaf went straight from the refrigerator into the preheated Dutch oven that had been in a 500-degree oven for an hour. This loaf sat out on the countertop for 2 hours before it went into the 500-degree preheated Dutch oven. Now visually, there are some noticeable differences that we can see before we even slice into them. This loaf that was made only over the course of the regular recipe with no refrigeration time is a beautiful, perfect loaf. It's perfectly proof. There was no busting or anything like that. It's just a gorgeous, gorgeous loaf of bread. These two loaves that spent time in the refrigerator are going to have a more intense flavor. That's just the way it goes. When those yeasts slow down and have longer to do their work, a lot more flavorful byproducts are produced. Now, the loaf that went straight from the fridge into the oven shows signs of bursting right here across where we scored it. You can see that. Now, that's not a very pretty loaf, even though I'm sure it's going to taste good. But part of this happened not because of over or underproofing, but because the refrigerator is a very dry environment. And so the outside skin of the bread had dried out significantly. And when I cut through it, it kind of broke. Some of that can be moderated by covering the loaf with plastic wrap in the refrigerator to hold in the bread's moisture so that outside part of the loaf doesn't desiccate. The thing that's interesting is that the loaf that spent 2 hours at room temperature didn't have nearly as much busting as the loaf from the fridge did. And that is simply because as that loaf sat out at room temperature, moisture from the inside of the dough migrated and rehydrated that skin. So the skin wasn't so rough and didn't crack open. But any kind of cracking like this does tell us that there is at least some amount of underproofing in the loaf. And clearly it wasn't the first rise because these all had the exact same first rise duration, which was 12 hours. And this loaf had no cracking. This means that the underproofing step happened in the refrigerator. In essence, these loaves went into the oven too soon. They needed a little bit more time to proof or to rise so that that outside skin was large enough to accommodate the expansion of the inside of the bread. What this tells me is, for visual sake, the longer the bread is out of the refrigerator at room temp, the more it can expand and reduce this breaking or cracking in the outside of the loaf. Again, that really is probably purely cosmetic. And as long as you don't mind the look of a kind of janky loaf that's split open a bit, going straight from the fridge into the oven is perfectly fine. But if you're aiming for a perfectly beautiful loaf, it looks like you should probably leave the loaf outside of the fridge for 3 to 4 hours before it goes into the preheated Dutch oven. Now let's slice into all of these and look in the interior crumb. Here's our loaf that did not spend any time in the fridge, and it's actually a day old because I baked it yesterday, while these other two were spending time in the fridge. So, it's got a fairly nice crumb to it. Nice and moist, springy. Smells delicious. Now to our loaf that went straight from the refrigerator into the oven. The crust is nice and shattery, of course, because it was baked an hour ago. And slightly more open crumb than the bread that was baked on the second day. But otherwise, not too much of a difference. And now for our bread that warmed up for 2 hours outside the fridge before it was baked. And honestly, only slightly superior crumb to this other one that went straight in from the fridge. We'll line these up right next to each other. Actually, a fairly noticeably more open crumb than the loaf that came straight out of the fridge. So it looks like our experiment proves that the quality of the bread is definitely going to improve if you let it sit outside of the refrigerator for at least 2 hours. And I'm betting a full 4 hours outside of the fridge, like you have on the normal schedule of the bread if it's not refrigerated, is probably going to yield the best loaf of all. Another question I get asked a lot is, can I add other things to this bread? And the answer is absolutely. I actually very rarely bake this bread without adding something yummy to it. My favorite thing to add is chopped up fresh rosemary from my garden. But the sky's the limit. You can stuff it full of garlic cloves, either roasted or raw, chopped up or whole. One of my favorite things to do is pickled jalapenos with sharp cheddar cheese. Some people like to put chocolate chips, olive bread, pimento bread. Different seeds and nuts can go into the bread as well. So there's really no limit to the modifications you can make to this recipe in terms of additions. If you're mixing in additional ingredients, you want to mix them in the very beginning stage when you're mixing together the flour and the salt into the water and the starter. You don't want to add your extra ingredients later after the first rise because as you're working them into the dough, you're going to press out all that wonderful air that's been created by the first rise. So add them in the very beginning. The only thing I need to caution you about is if the ingredient you're adding to the bread is particularly salty, like olives or a very, very salty cheese or pickled jalapenos or anything like that, then that can take the saltiness of this bread over the top because we already have an increased salt content intentionally because that helps us with flexibility in our timing. So if you're going to add olives or anything else like that to the bread, knock down the salt content to about 1/2 ounce instead of the 3/4 ounce. That'll help you balance it out. Also, if you're adding an ingredient that's particularly moist, like olives or artichoke hearts, roasted green peppers, hatch chilies, or anything like that, you might also back off just slightly, maybe 1/2 ounce on the water portion of the recipe because your wet ingredients are going to contribute extra moisture to that dough. Also keep in mind that many ingredients are going to contribute their own bacterial and yeast profiles to your dough, especially if you're taking an ingredient in from the outdoors, from the garden or something like that. If you'll take a look right here, this is the loaf of bread we started with sourdough starter that had not been fed in 3 months. And you'll see it's not particularly boisterous, but I started another loaf of bread with the exact same starter, and you'll see quite a considerable difference in the rise. And this is because this bread has sharp cheddar cheese in it. And that sharp cheddar cheese is produced with its own bacterial and fungal profiles, and it's contributing some of that to my dough. And this long 24-hour rise that we've had has allowed the unique bacterial profiles and yeast from that cheese to really flourish inside the dough, and we have a higher rise than we do on the other loaf that was made with the exact same starter, which has really been starving for the last 3 months. Pretty interesting little side-by-side comparison there. The last couple of questions I get deal with starter, and the first one is answered very clearly in the video, but a lot of people still ask, do I need to feed my starter before I bake the bread? No! That is the entire point of this recipe. It is supposed to be easy and you don't have to plan ahead for it. You pull your starter out of the fridge, even if it hasn't been fed in several weeks or even months, and you measure out 4 ounces and you bake bread. Now, if your starter is super sleepy like that, yes, it's going to require a full 24 hours, maybe a bit longer for the primary fermentation, and it's going to take the full 4 hours or maybe 5 or even 6 before it goes into the oven. That's fine. But you do not need to feed your starter before you bake this bread. You feed your starter when you get low on starter. That way you're not discarding a bunch of starter, which is super wasteful. But a lot of people send me pictures of their starter and say, I think I killed it. It's covered in this nasty black goo, this gross smelling liquid on top of it, and I'm sure I need to create a new starter, right? No. This is actually also a perfectly normal state for your starter to be in. All this black liquid means is that your yeast are slumbering quite peacefully. They've already chewed through as much food as they can go through, and they're chilling out, waiting for more. Now, you don't even have to feed your starter at this state before baking bread. All you need to do if your starter is in this state is to stir it back together to evenly distribute that water throughout the matrix, measure out 4 ounces, and you're good to go for baking bread. Now, if your starter has gone to sleep like this, you will achieve faster rise times if you'll go ahead and give it a feeding in this state, but you don't have to. Now, I don't want you to confuse the liquidy nature of this starter here for being a starter that's not at 100% hydration. If your starter is this liquidy immediately after feeding it, then yes, you're feeding your starter a higher ratio of water to flour. But over time, the acidic component of the starter actually chews through those gluten bonds, and it renders a texture that's a lot looser than it is immediately after you feed starter with fresh flour. So don't think that you need to feed the starter extra flour when it has this texture after it's been in the fridge for several weeks or months. That's perfectly normal. Just give a standard feeding of equal parts flour and water to at least double the weight of your starter. Now, to prove that you can bake a great loaf of bread with starter that hasn't been fed in 3 months, we're gonna do it. So, 4 ounces of this super old starving starter. 12 ounces filtered water. 1.4 ounces of flour, had to open a new bag, and 3/4 ounce of salt. Now, see how nice and stiff this dough is, even though our starter was really liquidy? That's because the starter had definitively equal parts of flour and water, even though the gluten bonds in that starter had long since dissolved away due to the acidity. All right, it is 4:30 p.m. here. I am going to put this starter in a gallon-sized Ziploc bag, and we'll be back tomorrow to check out how it looks. It has been 24 hours, and as you can tell, our loaf made with that starving starter that hadn't been fed in 3 months has definitely doubled. Now, this is not the robust kind of a rise that you will see from a very mature starter that's been fed recently. Take a look at what that looks like, right? That Ziploc bag is puffed up almost as tight as a balloon. But I know from previous experience that this bread is going to bake up into a perfectly acceptable loaf, and it's going to have a much richer, more intense flavor because that starter is so old and that yeast have been fermenting for so long and breaking down all of their byproducts into flavorful compounds. So, it's time to form this into a loaf. It feels nice and light and spongy, which is really a good sign. Lots of good aeration in that loaf. Okay, I've got it nice and tight here. Transfer it. I'm using a small rising vessel because I'm actually going to bake this loaf in my smaller 3 to 4 quart Dutch oven. That's going to give it lots of support as it rises to give it as much, strength around the edges as we possibly can. If I knew that I was baking with a really robust starter that's been fed in the last several weeks, I'll use my larger Dutch oven. Now we'll take a look at this loaf in 4 hours and see if it's ready to be baked. 4 hours later, I have had an undisclosed amount of wine, and look at our loaf. It is absolutely gorgeous. You guys, this was made from a starter that had not been fed in 3 months, all right? I've got my screaming hot Dutch oven right here. I'm gonna go ahead and score the loaf with scissors. Carefully transfer it into that screaming hot Dutch oven. And get that in the oven. And so we're gonna pull it out of the oven. And here we go. Gorgeous. This is as beautiful a loaf of bread as it possibly gets. And this is from a starter that has not been fed in over 3 months. This is one of the starters that we created on my sourdough starter series back at the end of April. It is now the end of August. That's almost 4 months. It's really, really extraordinary. I can tell that this bread is going to be unbelievably delicious because every time I have baked a starved loaf like this, it's been utterly extraordinary. But we're going to wait just a little bit to cut into it because I don't want it to get all gummy when we run the bread knife through it. All right, so I've got both loaves here that have fully cooled. They were both made with that starter that had been starved for literally 3 months. Now we're going to cut into them and see how they look. First off, the pure loaf with no additions. And that is absolutely gorgeous. Oh my God, it smells so incredible. And I know from previous experience exactly how delicious these loaves taste that are baked with those starved starters. Still, I'll go ahead and take a bite, just to tease you. Anybody that tells you you got to feed your starter every single day has no clue what they're talking about. Now, I want to introduce you to a friend. This, my friends, is 50 pounds worth of scientific knowledge about bread baking. This is the world's foremost compendium of knowledge about the science of bread baking. If you are willing to part with 100 of your hard-earned dollars, which I gladly was and do not regret, you too can own the world's vast and most comprehensive knowledge about the science of bread. Now, these genius folks at Modernist Cuisine up in the Pacific Northwest literally spent years testing every single control factor in bread baking. Way more sophisticated than the sad shit that I do here in my kitchen, right? And from those years and years of research, they created this. There is no information more comprehensive about bread baking anywhere on planet Earth. But if you read this compendium, and you should, if you are very, very serious about bread baking, you should buy it and you should read every word. I should know, I've read it twice. But if you read this, the scientific knowledge contained herein will tell you that this recipe that I've shown you today contains too much salt. It will kill the yeast, and the yeast will not be able to produce a good loaf of bread. Within these volumes, it will also tell you that you must feed your sourdough starter every 36 hours. For to go longer than 36 hours between feedings will produce an inferior loaf. This, ladies and gentlemen, is not inferior. It is actually completely and utterly divine. And all I did was ignore my sourdough starter for 3 months in the fridge. And now, for our final loaf, also made with that starved starter, which is chock full of pickled red jalapenos and extra sharp Vermont cheddar cheese aged 3 years. You know what? I'm going to take this baby to bed, and nobody wants to see that. I'm Ben Starr, the ultimate food geek. Hit up my website at benstarr.com, my Facebook at TheBenStarr, and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more genius shit just like this. Have a great night.